Well, thank you for joining us. I am absolutely honored and delighted to be able to introduce Wendy Mackay. Wendy is a pioneer in the field of human-computer interaction. She has won an enormous string of accolades, most recently the field's highest honor, the SIGCHI Lifetime Research Award. And we're particularly lucky because we get to hear a reprise of the talk that she gave when she received this award at CHI this year. And so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about Wendy's research because I think she'll do a much better job telling that story. But I do want to talk about one thing I find particularly inspiring about her approach, which is that I think in HCI, one of the things we do really well is we drive a lot of innovation, right? Innovation in novel interaction designs, novel systems, novel empirical results. But one of the things that I think really distinguishes Wendy's approach is that she usually goes beyond that that bit of novelty. She spends a lot of time thinking about the so what. And that often manifests in what I think in HCI we like to call theory. And I really hope that this talk inspires a lot of us to produce more of that sort of theoretically grounded HCI work. And before I turn things over to Wendy, the one other thing that I want to sort of mention is that as a field, I think HCI is really lucky to have people like Wendy in leadership positions because not only is she sort of advancing the field and the incredible research she produces, but she is also an incredibly kind and thoughtful mentor to many of us in the field, myself included. And so I think it's really great that we have folks like her sort of in the positions that they are. As a small example, I was casually chatting with Wendy to invite her to kind of give this talk again, partly for selfish reasons, because me and my group didn't get to go to CHI and I really wanted to see this talk. And Wendy's response was, yes, of course, but could I also teach a class over a whole day, which is what we're going to have the pleasure of hearing from tomorrow. So, I think that's just a small example of how Wendy kind of consistently goes above and beyond. And so please join me in welcoming Wendy.
Thank you. Thank you, Arvin. That was really lovely. I appreciate it. And I appreciate all the people who are here from my past in different areas and so on. It's lovely being here. And I want to say this is a very interesting challenge to make a talk about 40 years of research in a short period of time. At the CHI conference, it was supposed to be 40 minutes. I'll indulge myself and do a little bit longer, but I hope not too much longer. And I want to start with the title here. The official title was The Design of Interactive Things from Theory to Design and Back Again. That's great. But I was talking to the person who is running the awards committee, and I made a joke, and I said, well, really, my history is really about WWW, which I translate as Wendy's Words of Wisdom. And to my shock, that's what showed up in the GUIDE program. And I said, okay. But it turned out to be a really useful thing for me to figure out how to organize this talk. And so what I've done is I've realized that my career basically started at the same time as SIGCHI. So CHI started its first conference in 1983 here in Boston, and I went to that conference, and ever since I've been actively involved in this community, and I'll say more about that. But what's interesting is that my research interests have changed and evolved over the years, but they've matched these kinds of themes and topics over the years in CHI as well. So what I'd like to do is sort of share with you how I grew up with CHI and how those different themes emerged and evolved over time. So there we go. We have 4 decades of research. That's really a shock. Doesn't feel like I'm that old, but anyway. And these are the themes that inspired me. And what I would say, particularly for the students here, many of these things were things that I was caring about and interested in when I was a graduate student and before. And they're still with me today. And you need to pay attention to the things that inspire you early in your career because they will continue to nourish your career as you go on. But I won't go through that right now. We'll go through this bit by bit. Okay, so we're going to start in the 1980s, actually a little bit before. And this is something I've added for the people who were at CHI. This is something that wasn't there. So when I was in high school, I had a job bagging groceries. And you're thinking, what on earth has this got to do with HCI? And at the time, they had what they called box boys. I was a box boy. And we packed the groceries. And all the guys around me, mostly it's guys, and they would pack the bags as fast and as full as possible. And they would carry this big, huge bag to the car. And basically what you get is this. You get this poor woman who's carrying the stuff to the car. It breaks at the car. It breaks when they get home. They can't find anything. And it's just a mess. And so it's a really boring job. Really boring job. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to figure out how to do this really well. So what I did was I thought about who is the user here. And the user is generally a young female housewife with kids who is trying to wrestle some kids and get the groceries home. And I thought, well, I have to take groceries home. What do I want? And what I want is a bag that is light enough for me to carry, not some big strapping young man, but me. And there are certain things that you don't want the bleach to go on your strawberries. That's not a good idea. And you want to think about, well, what's the order in which I'm going to unpack it? I'm going to want the frozen stuff out first, get that in the freezer, then the cold stuff goes in the fridge. And then after that, we work these things out. And we organize the bag. The bags are square, so you create a platform at the bottom and then you build stuff on top and you put the strawberries at the very top. And so the idea of what I now call user-oriented thinking has always been with me. It's something about, think about it from the user's perspective. And often I'm the user, but sometimes somebody else is. And it was actually a pretty successful and interesting job because I was able to think about the user's perspective, and that made the job interesting to me. Now, one of the things that I want to say also is that when growing up, I had a dad who was an engineer. He designed gas turbine engines. He ran his own company. He did miniature gas turbines. He's one of the people who invented cogeneration. My mom is an artist. And she taught art to autistic children. She did all kinds of interesting things. She taught art. But boy, engineers and artists do not look at the world in the same way. And I decided to be a bit of a rebel and go and be a scientist, because that's a different thing yet again. And so I went into UC San Diego as an experimental psychologist. I didn't start out that way. I thought I was going to be an English lit major, but that changed pretty quickly. And I want to talk about a couple of things from UCSD. One of the things that I'm actually really proud of is that there is something called the UCSD Food Co-op. UCSD still does not know that I invented that thing, but I did. There was a guy selling apples. He would get a crate of apples and he'd sell them one by one. And I was a very impoverished student. I had no money. And I saw him making money and doing this. And I was an 18-year-old house advisor. And he came to me and he said, well, can we get a closet somewhere where we can sell these apples out of the closet? And I said, sure, we'll work this out. And then over time, over the next 3 years, we basically built up this food co-op. And the deal was that if you spent 4 hours a week, you get 15% off. And we did all these things. We had this, somebody went and sourced some refrigerators in San Francisco, most of which were broken, but we got them all down on a truck and then they redid that and we were able to sell cheese, and we would have parties every Friday night and we'd have cheese cutting parties and bag, cashews and almonds and things like that. And we had this wonderful guy who would go up to the LA food markets at 3 a.m. and come back, and he would service the local restaurants, but give us this really wonderful top-notch strawberries and things like that. I'm really into strawberries right now, aren't I? And I knew about strawberries because I'd been in Hughes Market and I could tell you what good strawberries. Anyway, but the idea there was this kind of creating a community and creating their own opportunities. So this was a case of something where I could really use the money. It was really a question of survival in some ways, but it was also creating an opportunity and seeing where the opportunities were. And I'm really proud of the fact that 50 years later, that food co-op is still in existence at UCSD. All right, the other thing that I did at UCSD is I shifted from literature to psychology. I was really fascinated by psychology and how people think and so on. And I was required to take a really boring computer science class. And we had all these punch cards and, you get one run at night. Actually, I worked really late at night. You could con the guy into doing multiple runs if it's 2 a.m, but anyway, that's another thing. And then I got an A in the class. I learned about Algol and this big Burroughs machine. And I thought, this is so boring. I'm never going to touch a computer in my life again. Done. And then in the psychology class, we had to do real-time programming. And we programmed these things. Mine were much neater than this. I don't have any photographs of mine, but mine were much prettier than that. But basically a relay rack is you have flip-flops, you have ones and zeros, and you're basically building a fundamental circuit. And my story here is there was a graduate student. Most of the grad students were men, but there was one woman, Nancy Groschwitz, and we had a class, a lab, where we had to build our own experiment, and mine would keep breaking down, as most students did. And the guys would come along and they'd fix it for me. And she came along and she said, Wendy, just fix it yourself. And I looked at her like, they usually fix it for me. And she said, no, you know how to do this. This is not that hard. This is not rocket science. You can do this. And I figured out how to do this. And then I started programming, and then I got a job doing this, and I got really interested in it. And then I realized that if you want to learn something, you have to convince yourself that it's interesting. You have to find the thing that is cool about it. There's a lot of boring things out there, and I hate being bored. So I need to find something that's interesting. And this was like the way of getting interested into that. All right, so then it was time to go to graduate school. And for a variety of reasons, I ended up at Northeastern University, which I have some colleagues here. And my goal at the time was to teach language to non-human primates. Okay. It turns out there's not a huge job market for that, but that's another story. Now, this is actually another computer story, another user of a computer story, because the way it worked is somebody would have a paper tape reader, and we had these machines. Then we would run the experiments. They had lab assistants who would do this stuff, and they would print out paper tapes with all the data. And then they have a little cardboard thing on a desk, and you would literally look at the dots that were punched in the holes in the paper tape and count them and hand calculate your data. That was the practice at the time. And there was a PDP-11 in the corner, no, PDP-8 computer sitting in the corner unused with a paper tape reader. And I said, I am going to learn how to use this thing. And I taught myself how to program. I did very wonderful things like invented the stack and then discovered that other people had already done that. And, but it was an interesting thing because it was a real-time operating system. And I was really passionate about the stuff that we were trying to build. We were trying to figure out how to, understand this behavior with these monkeys. This is not R44, but R44 was my favorite monkey. It was lovely. I used to sing to him. Anyway, another story. Anyway, now that was all very interesting. And there's a story I could tell you about my master's thesis and my advisor disappearing for a while. And I realized that I was again poor and I needed some money. So I went to work for Digital Equipment Corporation while I was waiting. He disappeared and I had no advisor, and I thought I would work for a little while, and then finish my PhD in my spare time. And there really aren't any jobs for people in this field anyway, so it was going to be a challenge. So I did have this skill, though. I was about how to teach people how to learn stuff. And so DEC, Digital Equipment, focused on teaching engineers. Now, the way that they did that at the time is that they would have a 2-week course. So your computers were a VAX computer before that, these PDP-10s and PDP-11s, and big, huge computers. And you'd get a group of guys who would come to Bedford, Massachusetts for 2 weeks, and they would learn how to basically fix the computer, keep it running. And that's what DEC did. They had educational services, and that's what they did. But these computers were actually being used by managers, marketing people, secretaries, completely different user audience. And I had just taught myself how to make those relay racks work properly and the programming, the studies. And I knew that it would have been a whole lot easier if there was a way for me to learn how to use these things. So I thought about, well, why don't we make the computer teach people how to use the computer? What a great idea. And They thought I was nuts. In fact, I did a little study and I showed them, they were convinced that this would break their market. And I showed them, because I was a good psychologist, I did a study and I showed them there's a bimodal distribution in terms of what people needed. There's the non-engineers over here, and then there's the engineers over here. No overlap basically in what they needed to know. So what I did over time is I built a little system called VMS CAI. VMS is the VAX management system, and CAI is computer aided instruction. It's basically a little online course that I would have liked for me to learn how to use the operating system. And I put it onto a computer at the DEC User Society conference. Every 6 months they would have the, oh, hello. And thank you. And what happened was it was just running there in the corner and people discovered it. I pointed out and they say, this is exactly what I want. This is perfect. Where can I buy it? And I'd say, well, you can't, it's a prototype, but there's a suggestion box over there and you can put in your thing for the suggestion box. And I was a good scientist, so I was taking notes and asking people questions and trying to figure out what's going on. And then we went home, nothing happened, right? And I kept tinkering with it though, and trying to fix it. And 3 weeks later, I get this call. Now imagine that I'm a 21, maybe 22-year-old working in this company. Everybody else who I'm working with is a guy. So I'm this younger female programmer. Nobody's listening to me. But then my boss's secretary comes to my office. These are open plan offices. So there's all the Playboy bunnies over there and the, smoke over here. And it's really, imagine Mad Men kind of, that was life at DEC in those days. And she comes running in and she says, oh, there's this senior 5 levels up from me, vice president on the phone, and he thinks he wants to talk to you. And it's like fear in my heart. What on earth is going on? And it turned out that customers had been calling up and saying, we need this software. We need to learn how to use your system. Please, 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 where is it? And he'd been looking around for weeks trying to find somebody, and somebody had finally tracked me down in Ed Services thinking that maybe I knew something about this thing. And I'm incredibly proud of my 22-year-old self, because when he said this, I said, well, if you give me $200,000, and this is a lot of money in that time, I was getting paid $18,000, to give you an idea. I will go and build this system for you if you give me, couple months. And of course, he said yes. And so I used that money to then go create an authoring language so we could build more of these. And we put it on the DEC machines. It was bundled. I found out there's a really interesting little side story where the people who ran the hotline were really mad that this new piece of software that they had not vetted went onto the computer. And so they tracked all the hotline calls before and after, dropped by 30%. Boom. And they went, oh, not that we got the money back, but still. But there's another interesting story too, because 6 months later, the numbers went back up. And the reason was the first half, it prevented them from asking really stupid questions. And then 6 months later, the questions and the demand on the hotline went up because they were asking more sophisticated questions because they were really learning how to use the computers, which I think is a good result. I'm not sure the hotline did, but anyway. The long story short is that even if you don't have any power, and I didn't, early in my career, I had none. All the methods and everything I have are based on somebody who has no power. It is the case that customers have power. And if you can get to them and they support you, that will change everything. So as an HCI person, customers are very powerful. Now, this VMS thing I did was to teach people like me, and I did this stealth marketing. Okay, so I should have gone here. This was a new DEC, a business, and I actually ended up getting transformed into a manager, and we did over 30 products using this authoring language, and I hired a bunch of people, and we had a whole business there at DEC. But what's also interesting at the same time, a little bit later, this is 1984 now, a little bit later, just before the Macintosh, I'd like to say before the Macintosh came out, Lynn Olson, who's a hardware engineer, invented a way of looking at video on a computer. And she created what they called a learning station. We had video discs that big. So imagine a DVD, which some of you probably can't even imagine anymore. But anyway, in the old days, we had big video thingies, and you could record and put video on a VT52, VT100. You remember VT100 terminals. But the idea is that we could have video. And so what I did was I transformed, with the help of Ken Moreau, who is the only programmer I've ever met who could say that will take me 4.5 days to program, and he'd be absolutely right. He was a brilliant programmer. But we created this thing called Producer, which ended up being a product, and it was basically for designing these interactive video systems. So we did the first commercial product with interactive video. I remember there's one moment where we were trying to do a research video disc, and we got stopped because Bruce Springsteen was doing Born in the USA, and it took out the entire disc pressing capacity in the world for a little while. Anyway, and this, for those of you who've been around for a while, there was a system called HyperCard. HyperCard was actually better, but we did it before, and it was the same kind of idea. And so the idea is that there's this business that we created, and it's all about, the user. And this guy is a claymation character named Dwayne. He hops around, and we used IVUS to do what we call the interactive troubleshooting simulator. And what we did is we looked at how all the calls that come, so you have a beta test of your hardware. It goes out in the world, and you have your key people who are going to test this thing out, and they report all the bugs. And so what we did is we got all the bugs, and we then built a troubleshooting simulator, and we had Dwayne here who spoke deck talk, which sounds a little bit like a drunken Swedish soldier or somebody, like a little bit. But anyway, there's still some metros that have that voice. It's been around for a long time. But anyway, it turns out when you're a child's voice, it's much easier to do the interaction because people ask easier questions than if it's an adult voice. So we use the child voice to have Dwayne talk. Anyway, but the idea here is that we created this environment. We backed it up from the users and the real problems that they had, and we created this whole process of how to interact with the system. And IVUS actually was used internally for a good decade after it stopped being a product. So anyway, summary, lesson learned, audience really matters. And if you can pay attention to who it is that you are designing things for, they will teach you things and help you to do things. All right, so this leads me into multidisciplinary design methods. And I will say again, imagine a young woman in this very male environment, very technical environment, and it's not as enlightened as we are now today. And so there's a lot of methods that I use that come from different disciplines, but are always trying to help somebody who is trying to do the right thing, but doesn't have the ability to just say, we're doing it that way. So if you think about how people think about design, you can think about the ways in which you're trained. So we get trained as scientists, and those of us who are trained as scientists, we collect data about users, we analyze that data, we do tests of users' reactions, and then we inform the designers, right? So scientists aren't trained to actually design things. They are trained to analyze and observe things and test things. Engineers are much more likely to be trained to do a functional spec, thinking about how it's supposed to work. They implement that functionality and they test it in different ways, but the kinds of testing are a bit different. The scientist might be testing with users, an engineer might be doing calibration things and other ways without users at all. And then finally, you have designers. And what I love about working about designers is, unlike engineers, they're always questioning the design brief. So for example, if you're in an engineering class and they say, I want you to solve this problem, you don't get to say, no, I think I'll solve that problem. It's much more interesting. But a designer can do that. A designer can say, well, I'm going to challenge the design brief. We're going to think about it this way, and they do that. And so they also consider the context of use. And there's this whole idea about inspiring ideas. And so the question is, how do we in this very multidisciplinary field combine and take the best of each of these, not get stuck in one way of thinking, but really try to benefit from each. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of an early system that we built using my skills as an experimental psychologist. We used what's called a Wizard of Oz technique. This was way back in the day when this was a new term. And the idea of a Wizard of Oz, if you imagine the 1939 movie, you have Dorothy and she's talking to this big Wizard of Oz sort of created thing. And then there's a little dog that pulls back a curtain. You see that there's a wizard who's operating things. So the idea here is that the researcher is pretending that everything is working and they're creating this environment. And the users are here. And we have two different users here. And they're trying a text editor. And what we did is we made it so that we were trying to figure out whether we needed an intelligent text editor. We were doing AI stuff. This is back in well, that paper was published in 01, but this was back in the 80s when we did it. And so imagine you have three command sets, one that gets tutoring help. And the user is like, for example, I'm watching Arvind and what you're doing and saying, okay, you need this thing, and you're doing a really boring task, really boring. And so you know nothing about the existing commands except what I tutor you. And then Michelle is yoked. So you are randomly getting everything that I'm giving to you, but it's completely unrelated to what you're doing. And then after half an hour, we swap. And you get, I'm paying attention to you, and now you're getting the random set. And people said things like, oh, the computer figured out how I worked. It got better. Or, oh, the computer suddenly hates me. What's going on? But what I learned from that was that there is a fundamentally different view of how I could look at these results. If I looked at the quantitative results, I could say, well, if there's no tutoring, then every student, I mean, everybody who's getting help here, doesn't do anywhere as well as the people who do get the two types of tutoring. And there's no difference, no statistical difference between the ones that are yoked and non-yoked. They both learn. They're both annoyed or helped, but they learn the same amount. But boy, if you listen to the qualitative results, it's night and day. They hate it or they love it. And what I learned from that is that there's no such thing as just getting the data, and that the quantitative data is not enough. The qualitative and the quantitative together give you a much more full picture. Now, I realize I'm going way too slowly, so I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. I apologize. But there's this idea of triangulation, which means we wrote a paper on this, but you want to combine quantitative and qualitative. And this is one for everybody who, especially if you have an engineering background, please do not run the study if you don't care about the results. Only run, studies take a bunch of time. They really do. So only run studies that matter to you. And that means, by the way, if you've got some qualitative data in there, you will learn things that you wouldn't learn otherwise, and those will be more interesting studies. So we can go on, and I'll talk about that.
So I'm just trying to understand that last.
Yeah.
So was it that people loved it and hated it, and then you combine the statistics and average difference?
No, it was two different findings. If you looked at the findings, the quantitative findings, you would say there's no difference between directed tutoring and random tutoring. And the conclusion from that would be, yeah, just throw information randomly at people. They will learn it. You don't have to do a fancy intelligent editor. They'll just learn it and it'll be fine. But qualitatively, people will hate the random one, and they'll like it.
I don't understand what accounts for the difference there.
In one case, it's basically the tutoring is watching what Arvind is doing and only giving him advice based on what he wants to do. So I can tell that he's about to need this command, and I give that command to him.
Oh,
Explain that, right? And then,
how do you get to, when you did that study, why are the two study results? So if you have 50, so if you say, if you ask people, how do you like this?
I'm going to have to take this as a question at the end because I'll never get through the rest of it, but all right. Okay, so this is a thing on design methodology. I have this little booklet. This is a course that I taught at CHI 23, and it goes into some of these methods. I'm going to have to go very quickly through it. I have a few of them that I can give out today if you want. There's an online version of it as well. And there's a longer book that will be published through ACM Press and Morgan Kaufman, but coming later. There's a whole bunch of new methods that we've interviewed, that we've created over the years. And I'm going to focus really quickly. But one of the things that I want you to do is think about when you interview people, do not interview the way you see people interview on TV. What you want to do is get people's stories. And this comes out of a conversation with Stu Card, who's one of the most brilliant people I've ever met, a founder of HCI as a field. And he told me about critical incident technique, which is by Flanagan in 1954. The critical incidents are plane crashes. And the long story short is if you want to understand the cause of the plane crash and you have survivors, it only works with survivors, you interview the pilots, but you walk them through every step up to the way, up to what happened in the incident. And then you get this rich detail that helps you understand. Now, critical incident technique is about understanding the cause of that crash. For us, well, first of all, we have fewer critical incidents of that magnitude. But secondly, we are actually trying to get this information to help us do design. So we do what I call story interviews, where we're trying to work with users and get these stories out of people. And there's various other things. We can do it with story questionnaires, which I did with Carla Grigio and others, and Victor Gustafsson, and then Rita Halal, and particularly Nolwenn Maudet did story portraits, which is a way of illustrating these things. Here's another piece of advice, and this is for any of you in graduate school, and even if you're beyond graduate school. When you talk to users, look for surprises. This is my advisor, Murray Sidman at Northeastern, who told me to do this, and he was absolutely right. It's the best single piece of advice anybody's given to me, and I give it to you. But I'll add more. When you see somebody doing something that surprises you, write it down now. If you see it again and again and again, it will stop surprising you. So your job is to try to figure out, why does it surprise me? And then if you figure that out, figure out what are the implications for the design of a system that would address that, okay? Very important. Okay, so look for stories, we did that. Another thing that I wanna say is that I deal a lot, I'm at INRIA and the University of Paris-Saclay. I deal with a lot of computer scientists from France. They are trained as mathematicians. They're really excellent mathematicians. And they think in abstractions. And it's wonderful. I'm very happy that they can do that. But I want to point out that you can get abstractions if you're looking for those details. But you can't get details from abstraction. I got that bad. Flip that around. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I thought I had fixed the typos and I did not fix that one. Not detail from abstractions, all right? So once you've looked at a setting, you can start abstracting, you find the surprises, you can figure out what's interesting. But the other way around, if you go in with a stereotype of how it's gonna look, you're not gonna get anywhere else, right? You're just gonna be up there and you'll have the same stereotype that everybody else does. Whereas if you start with the details and the surprises, then you will get things that other people don't have. Another thing that I ask my students to do is a small version of what we call thematic analysis. Some of you have heard about this as a technique, but there's a specific way of doing it. You can look for breakdowns, workarounds, and user innovations. And for anybody that's in industry who's looking at this talk and saying, we don't have time to talk to users, you're being really short-sighted, because users innovate. They know their job, they're in a context, and they often make small or sometimes big innovations. It costs you nothing. Other people will do it. You can sell it. It teaches you about your own system. And you have to look, and you will see these things. And that's part of the surprises too. So look for breakdowns, those you can maybe fix. Look for the workarounds, that also tells you something about the system, but don't forget user innovations. All right, explore new ideas. We did a lot of work with video and brainstorming and prototyping. These are some examples. And the fundamental story that I tell my students is, if you're gonna design something, stop talking about it and just make something. Right? The more you talk about it, you talk a little bit at the beginning, all right? And then show me 3 different examples, sketch it, videotape it, make it, do something, but just do it. And that's actually what this book is about. It's called Do It, The Design of Interactive Things. Yes, Don Norman, there is a little wink there for the design of, yes, anyway. There's other methods that we have on hard to find users. This is something that we call the interactive thread. I work with people in safety critical systems. There's all this issue about how do you find users that are either fragile populations like kids, autistic kids, elderly, or airplane pilots, people running the energy grid in France. And so the question is, can you find either enjoyable activities or find them where they are or go to a conference with them or do things? Again, I don't have time to go into that. Generative theory, we will talk about tomorrow for those of you who are going to participate in this class, so I won't go into that, but there's ways of systematically generating ideas from stories. Stories help you fundamentally in HCI. All right, and I want to say something. We talk about the user experience, and I want to tell those of you who are designing interactive systems, you can never control the user interface. You can explore different contexts and you can understand about how your system will work in different contexts, but that context will always be unique in there. And so don't think that you're going to do the perfect system. It will always operate in some context. Okay, so this is the approach. Now I'm going to talk a little bit, and I'm really far behind, so I'm going to just keep going here. Video as a research and design tool. When I was here at MIT, this is actually the last full system I programmed. I was working with Gloriana Davenport, who's a wonderful filmmaker. And one of the things that I realized, we had this wonderful IVAS system that I was telling you about, and we brought it to MIT. And we built a system where the idea was not just to use video as an output, but as a tool for a researcher. So this is me observing somebody and annotating like, oh, he's making an error, he's doing something, and figuring out, we're doing live annotation of the system. And then, oh, yeah, right. So what I learned is if you're going to make a way of communicating with somebody about a new design idea, if you have no power, you want to show them video to show them how that works. So we did that, and we had a system for analyzing what people did and showing the powers that be how that worked. Then there's another system that I worked on with Michel here, Michel Baudouin-Lafont, a system called Diva, and this is a different way of streaming the video, and you get a view over time of your annotations of the system. And then you can do a stream algebra for saying, okay, look at all the instances where somebody does this and then a minute later they do this other thing, and you can kind of create this way of interacting with this annotated video over time. And there's a very old video, which is sort of working. I was working with air traffic controllers in France and studying their use of paper flight strips. And what you see here is that we're live annotating what's going on, or actually doing recording videos as well, and it streams by. And so that's a way of understanding. And then Jim Holland, who's been a important colleague over the years, has worked on a system called Chronovis, which is also inspired by this. And when we were at CHI, we have another thing called Video Clipper, which is a way of doing video where you combine the capturing of storyboards into the same medium as displaying them. I won't go into that here. All right, a little bit on SIG-CHI. As I said, I started my career is intertwined with the career or the life of CHI over the years. So the first CHI was in Boston in 1983, and I've been to all of them ever since. I'm proud of that. And the third CHI came back in 1986, and by then I was running a research group, and we started doing a lot of really important things for CHI. So this is something I want to say, is that this was a community. It was the first time I found a bunch of people who thought the way that I did. And it was really refreshing to have people who really cared about the human side of computing. And so I felt like I'd tried to belong before, but not succeeded. And when I met CHI, it was like, okay, we have to create this community and make it work over time. And that's what I spent my time doing. So I've been, in the CHI executive committee as chair and all the other things, SIG board, pubs board, all kinds of things. We created the first local SIG, special interest group SIG was here in Boston, Greater Boston SIG with Kate Ehrlich. We also did Interactions Magazine and Tokai, and we sponsored WIST and CSVW. There was a big question of whether those conferences would be in competition with CHI. And when I was chair of CHI, it was like, no, we want to make these important parts of the CHI community. And since then we've created, and we are now the largest SIG in all of ACM. And this was something that I did with Deborah Tater. We did a special issue on video as a research and as a design tool. So thinking about it as a tool, not as an output like Hollywood, but as a tool for doing research. And then that became the basis for doing what is now Interactions Magazine, although John Reinfrank and Shelley Evanson took it and put a professional gloss on it and made it good. And it was also a time when we were thinking about SIG-CHI as a home or a community for both kinds of researchers. It's the people who study people who want to think about the implications for the design of technology, and people who build technology but want to think about the impact on human beings. And then we started bringing in designers, and then we started bringing in all kinds of other communities, and it was really important. Another thing that I'm proud of is that we did CHI 2013 in Paris, and this was well, interesting because ACM is pretty American-centric, and they were not expecting, they were expecting what, 1,800 people, and we budgeted for 1,800, and then we got 3,600, I think. So it was kind of a success. And one of the things we did, a number of innovations. So we put the CHI proceedings on a key, because that's that was the first proceedings, and then 93, and then going, and then that was 2009, and by then it went to DVDs, and then finally we did it on a key. So we're kind of like getting more and more stuff crammed in smaller and smaller things. And we created video previews. I would love to talk to you about that. And Arvind, you worked on that. There's some really cool stuff. And then the last thing I want to say, and this is to my colleagues in CHI, please let's go back to it. We had something called author sourcing. Dave Carter, who's in the back, helped us with this. It was the COBE system. We have this way of analyzing what's going on. But one of the things that was really successful, this is our wall-size display. There's me, there's Michelle, there's some other grad students in there. We have the entire program on there. And we asked authors to say which program, we gave them 10 different papers that were related and said, I'd love to have this in my session. It'd be fine. No, I don't want it, or I don't know. And with that, we got 87% of the authors who gave us feedback. And with that, it's the only time that I'm aware of that we had no orphan papers at CHI. We actually, everybody was happy with their session. Anyway, so I want us to support CHI authors and CHI attendees. Yes.
Anybody wants to help me rebuild that?
Oh, please, please, please listen to him. It's such an important thing to do. Yes. Please, I strongly echo that. All right, I'm only up to the 90s. Oh my God, I've got to keep going. All right, I'm going to go faster. You told me I was going to run out of time, and you're right. Okay, I went to Xerox Europark after graduating from MIT, and I ran a research group that was dealing with video because, of course, I knew about video. My thesis had nothing to do with video. You'll hear about that later. I just was doing CHI and video and my thesis at the same time. You were asking me about whether you can multitask as a PhD. Yes, you can. So we were kind of challenging the idea of video, like this one here is basically looking at me, and it's a video conference, and you also had video calls, but this is a media space. The idea is there's permanent links and you connect with people all the time. This is Christine King, who is the secretary. That's not me in the thing. And we also started working on this idea that we would be able to create media spaces and combine that. We were going to do a media space for engineers working on the Storebelt Bridge in Denmark. It was part of a big European project. But the problem is when we went and studied the engineers, we realized that they were never actually in their offices. And so doing a static media space in their office would be useless because they'd be gone most of the time. But they kept all of the information on these blueprints, and they wrote all of this information on the blueprints. And so we said, okay, well, let's augment the paper blueprints. And so this became a system called Ariel, Peter Wellner, who was in my group, did a very famous system called the Digital Desk. This is a different technology, but the same idea here. And the idea is that you can work with these and interact with it. And I think I have a quick video, yes, which is very fast. This is an A0 size video. I'm afraid the video is not very good because it's old. But every one has an identification, and then you can interact with it and you can glance at other people and communicate. But basically the idea is that this drawing that they've got with them all the time is their source of communication. And I'm gonna keep going. And so the idea here is we start thinking about, well, can we do sharing via physical objects, not just by location? And another thing that we did, and I'll just do this, we did a bunch of participatory design stuff. Now, I was working with the Scandinavians, and this whole idea, this is my son Matthew at age 5, I believe. We brought him in and collaborated. You can do life-work balance if you work with your co-researchers and you collaborate with them. Anyway, but the idea is to do this collaborative thing and not think about building technology for these people, for them to communicate within their families at a distance, but rather collaborate with them on the design of what we call technology probes. And the idea of a technology probe is not to think of it as a prototype of the finished thing, but as a way of exploring ideas with the users so that together you and they understand what it would be like to use some future technology in a real world context. And so what that was technology, which I believe is our highest cited paper. So anyway, the other thing is that we started playing with the idea of movement as a form of communication. So interacting via movement, not just commands. This is a system that's in the same kind of environment. This is something called Media Narrowspace. This is Nicolas Roussel, Helen Evans, and Heiko Hansen are working with us on this project. And the idea is that when I'm far away, the image is fuzzy, but when I'm close, it's a nice clear thing. And so I just through my movement, I can indicate whether I want to communicate with you or not. And these are people who are actually discovering this at the Pompidou Center in Paris. We had this as a big display. And you can tell if people know each other because they do that. They tap each other on the head, they poke each other's nose, they try to bite each other's nose. But if they're strangers, they recoil and they go, no, I don't want to touch you, oh no. Anyway, lots of interesting things to play with. And these were sort of fun. Another thing was marker clock. We did work with elderly people and found that they do not want video in their homes. If you're in your 80s, you don't want to look at pictures of yourself all the time. If you're in your 20s, maybe you do, but your 80s, you don't. And so what we did is we found this group of women. There were actually 4 of them, 3 of them gave us permission for their images. And they would knock on they were all widows, and they would knock on each other's door every morning to go out and go shopping, whatever. And they kind of kept an eye on each other, and they created this little miniature community. And we said, okay, well, what could we do rather than monitoring them and showing them like, I'm going to watch what you're doing, you know, and if you fall, we're going to, you know, call the ambulance. It's more like create a social network that they felt really comfortable with. And so the idea here of a marker clock is as this goes, it's looking at activity, and darker activity means that somebody's being active, like here, and weak activity or no activity is pale. And so you can look at a glance and you have me, for example, and the other person, you see where they are. And if I touch it, I'm leaving a message. And so there's this really lightweight way of interacting. And we have a lovely example of one of them where it was the other person's 77th birthday, and she did a tap, waited 10 minutes, a tap, waited 10 minutes, did it 7 times, and then every minute did 1 each. And so she get 77 on the clock. And that I thought was great. I love user innovation. Anyway, so the idea here is to support human interconnection, not this impersonal monitoring that we're doing. So this leads me to the tangible computing, which is another thing that sort of exploded in CHI. And I wanted to kind of think about like, well, it became very clear that we have different ways of thinking about the embodied nature of interaction. And we can augment people in different ways. We can augment the person. So I have my nice little smartwatch. I can do things with that. I can augment objects here. and I can also augment the environment around myself. And so we did a special issue on this in 1993. It's the only time that ACM has ever gotten the special issue of any science, the best special issue in any science by the American Association of Publishers. But it was basically launched this whole area of tangible computing. And I worked on this with Pierre Wellner, who's in my group at the time, and Rich Gold, who was at Park. And there's a number of really, you should look this up because there's a bunch of really key articles in there. There's Video Mosaic. Again, I think I'm going to have to start zipping through because I'm really, really late. So we did interactive video with embedding video in the table and then using paper interaction here. And that's video. We did, yeah, this is a video. I'm not going to have time. Anyway, the idea is we could tap and go with it and interact with other things and basically use paper to edit video, which turns out to be really cool. I'm going to zip through here. Worked with air traffic controllers. This is one of my more well-known thing. We looked at, this was originally a project where the idea was that they were going to transform this paper-based way of tracking aircraft with a keyboard and mouse kind of system. And it turns out that this is far safer, far better. And there's a number of interesting things. So they all have these paper flight strips. And they do things like, if you underline an altitude, that's a legal contract. It's the smallest legal contract I'm aware of. And they have various annotations and things that they do. And we basically created ways, we basically showed that, first of all, that it's highly interactive. They do a lot of things without talking. The more stressed it is, the less sound there is. And it's really important that they have this physical interaction so they know what's going on. And there's many more things to say about this, but I will keep going. They write on it. And so we built a system called Chameleon, which is paper-based. We did this really clunky prototype. This is Ian Rahimi and Anna Farah. This is also the one I did the tangible, triangulation paper with. She's a philosopher. Anyway, we learned a few things. Like, for example, if you double tap the flight strip and it shows you that aircraft on the radar, that is a killer app. They will kill for that. That is just because it saves them time, what they need. But then the other thing that we found is that if we had this cool feature that we thought we double tap and it shows the route that's coming up, and these junior guys said, great idea. And the senior guys said, no way, no way, no way, because it would de-skill them. It would make them not able to get a picture of the traffic. So anyway, so paper really is safer. Now I'm to the 2000s. How am I going to do 20 years in less than 5 minutes? Okay. I went to INRIA, arrived in France. We basically went from 2 researchers, one of whom is sitting in the room here, and Joël Coutaz, and they were the only HCI researchers plus a couple of grad students that you had at the time. And then since then, we've created a whole community, and we created things at INRIA. I was hired by INRIA as a research director, and we created what was then University of Paris Sud and is now called Paris-Saclay. And we have, over 100 researchers in HCI now. And we did a lot of work with supporting creativity, a lot of paper-based work with contemporary music composers. And one of the things that's really lovely about working with creative professionals is that they're constantly pushing the limits of the technology. So you get the benefit of working with creative people. You're not trying to make them creative. They're already really creative. You're trying to support that creativity. And you're not trying to make the unique tool that serves them, but rather give them opportunities to create their own tools. And so we will be talking tomorrow about substrates and things like that. But this is really where we started thinking about this idea of substrates. This is called a tonnetz. It was originally created by Euler in the 1700s for analyzing music. You can see scales if you know something about that. And then this is a system that uses the paper tonnetz. I don't know if we'll get sound. We're not getting. Okay, but the idea is that all through this space and create music, and you can use it as a composition tool also to play. And then this was picked up. I'm going to jump through quickly. Sorry. because we also worked with a professional composer, Philippe Leroux, very well known, who is working with these magnificent manuscripts from the 1300s. If you look at the way these work, the flags, like you see the normal 5-line staff and scale, but they have these amazingly expressive flags, and that's how you communicate expression. And so we created a system with what was called the Anoto pen at the time. And actually, Jeremy Garcia and before that, and Fanis Sandilas worked on this. And this is, let me see if I have is this the video? Yes, this is the video. This is really short. But the idea is that you can trace and interact with a copy of this, and then the way in which you interact is transformed into the software that is then played. And he's actually speaking, but you can read here. So this data is sent into a program that's called Open Music, and that gets transformed. The shape of the gesture then becomes part of the expression.
Sur la partition
Machaut
sur le manuscrit de Machaut qui correspond à cet élément-là, et qui nous donne donc des trajectoires qui sont utilisées là directement par les voix sous forme de glissés. On part cette fois d'un neume qui est un punctum et qui donne donc ces trajectoires-là. Si je les lis de façon un peu plus dilatée, elles sont comme ça. Et donc là, ce sont le violoncelle et la guitare, en fait, qui suivent exactement les contours
cello and the guitar playing this. You notice it goes from computer music to handwritten. That's what it is. And so the point here is not that this is a tool that everybody's going to use, but rather we're creating a tool for creating tools. And so you want to help artists create their own tools. Okay, human-centered AI, I'm going to talk a lot about that tomorrow, but I want to think about, like, very quickly, there are different ways of thinking about how we interact with technology. We can think of it as a tool, we can think of it as a servant, and we can think of it as a medium. And each of these has a whole field behind it in terms of how we think about it. And now what's happening, they're starting to merge. And so with generative AI, we get a lot of different things. And this is something that I want to say to those of you who are in graduate school, but even if you're a little older, it's really important to value diverse perspectives. It's great, do that. But hostile audiences are sometimes your best, most informative audiences, because they ask you questions and you go, what are you talking about? But then if you can figure out where they're coming from, it helps you articulate your own ideas better. And I've learned a lot from AI audiences who tend to be somewhat hostile in the nicest possible way, but they really do have a different perspective. And so there's a number of things here. I'm going to just do this really quickly. This is something called the expressive keyboard. A colleague, a friend of ours, Shumin Zhai, invented this with Perola. And the idea here is that you can swipe from key to key to make this. And so this is the word great, and they're all different. And the cleverness of the AI is to figure out that that's the word great. It's 40% faster than typing. Now you get it. I use it all the time on my phone. It's really great. But we were interested in a different problem. So you've seen this. Let me see. Why am I not going forward here? Yes, go ahead. There we go. So what we said is, well, every bit of human variation there is thrown away as noise. And we thought, well, that's an opportunity for human expression. And so what we do is we transform, instead of throwing away, we recognize the gesture, but instead of throwing away the variation, we also analyze that, and we transform that into rich output. And so the idea here is that we can, it's a little hard to see, but you can see that the font is changing. She can make it bold. She can interact with it in different ways through the way that she interacts. And we have different kinds of things, so she can change the font. We worked with a professional typographer to come up with different fonts, and we did a version of this that works with emojis that change faces, facial expressions, and so on. So you get the idea here, I think. Another one that I really like is called Octopocus. And the idea here is, what do you do? Why is it that when we have these devices, they're pretty much consumer devices? You know, there's information here and I can find stuff. My hands are extremely expressive and capable of doing things. This is an extremely powerful computer, but the level of interaction is basically pushing buttons and occasionally pulling something off a menu. And so we said, well, if you had gesture-based commands, that would work. But why does that not work? Well, you have to remember the gestures. So what can we do to help people remember these commands? And we want something where an expert who knows these gestures does it really quickly, and a novice can figure out the commands. And so what do novices do? They hesitate. So what we want to do is we have this idea of a smooth transition from an unconscious behavior, like I hesitate when I don't know what I'm doing. The system picks up on that and says, okay, well, now is the moment to give you some help. But then I can recognize the fact that, oh, when I pause, it'll give me that. And so then I can control it. So it becomes this sort of very easy transition. And this is a good example here. This was done with Olivier Beau. And it's called Octopocus. And the idea is that when you pause, it gives you a set of different gestures that you can then follow, and you get the idea of where you're going to go. They get smaller as they're less likely, and so on. Okay. And all right. There's a whole set of things, and I'm again going to be too short on this HCI, this stuff, but an AI person, a machine learning person, will think that you can do explainability and that the user wants you to explain the algorithm, but they never do. What you really want is to reveal the results of the algorithm in the user's terms through the user's action. And so we have a nice little example of this with a system for creating your own gestures. And we have a dynamic heat map here. And the idea is I can propose a gesture, and if it ends in the red area, that means that gesture has already been taken and it will not be a good idea to use it. If it ends in blue, that means it can be reliably recognized. And if it ends in purple, probably not a good idea, try again. And so what we have here is somebody who's defining a new kind of timer. When he does that, he says, oh, that's red, that's not so great. So he's going to try it again, and he's going to keep moving on and end in a blue, and that will be a gesture that can be recognized, and so on. Okay, now I'm going to skip through shared agency. There's a lot of things we can do on that. I'm going to emphasize the fact that it's not the algorithm. If you are an AI researcher, you are measured on the quality of your algorithm. But if you're going to build a real product, or if you're going to do human-computer interaction research, you should be measured on the quality of the interaction and the impact on the human being who's using that system. They're different. And it doesn't make sense to yell at AI people for not thinking about the user if the only way they get measured is on the quality of that algorithm. And we need people to do high quality algorithms. But we also need HCI, where we work with people or we create our own and we think about the interaction. All right, I'm going to jump through this because I'm now quite a bit over time. I'm really sad because this is such a fun project that we did with a bunch of theater people. There's she's just really cute. Anyway, this is using reinforcement learning, but the real thing with human beings, actually, not the fake stuff that you do in machine learning. And anyway, we can control her behavior, but she thinks she's controlling the system, and she's very cute. Anyway, there's human in the loop versus computer in the loop. I want to be clear, different algorithms with the same interaction can produce different results, and the same algorithm with a different interaction may produce different results. So anyway, so don't just measure the performance, measure the impact on the user. I'm going to jump through this. Final summary on that: most intelligent algorithms are neither necessary nor sufficient for creating better intelligent systems. Neither necessary nor sufficient, both of those. All right, 2020s, now I'm really, okay, generative theory of interaction. I'm going to be talking about this tomorrow. I know that's not good for the people who are just listening to this talk and not coming tomorrow, but this is the newest stuff that we're doing, and so you can read about it. Hi. But I do want to say one thing is that a challenge that we have as HCI researchers is to we want things that are simple to use, ideally, and we want things that are powerful, have power of expression. And there's a fundamental trade-off here between power of expression and simplicity of execution. But our challenge as researchers is basically to move this curve. We want to make sure that simple things remain simple and complex things become possible. I believe it's Alan Kay who first said that, right? And so we want to do this whole thing. There's a transition between theory and observation. I'm indebted to Lottie Balin, who is one of my professors here at MIT, who taught me about the idea that you have in natural sciences and social sciences, you have a transition between theory and empirical observation. And basically you go through theory to observation. And what we do is we work with artifacts. And so we have this more complex relationship here. So I'm going to not go through this in detail, but I do want to say that we have a lot of design methods, some of which I mentioned earlier, but there's also opportunities for generative theory that allow us to think about how to use theory to design new artifacts. And we have this paper with Michel Baudouin-Lafont and Susanna Bodker on generative theories of interaction, which talks about how to apply theory to specific design problems. So it allows us to study interaction as a phenomenon in its own right. This was going back to my thesis. One of these this is a picture from my thesis here. This is a case of getting interested in how people not only adapt to technology, they learn how to use it, but they also adapt it and change it and transform it. And that's really, really important. And it's been one of those things that's been with me my entire career. All right, I'm not going to go through all that. Making it simple is complicated. We're going to jump through. Sorry, sticky lines. Oh, this is such a nice little video, though. It's a way of reifying a tool, reifying the sticky line, transforming commands into objects, and then making them interactive. And there's all kinds of things I can say about that. I'm going to just jump through. So there's a set of research themes here. A lot of things that inspired me. A bunch of things that I learned. It's still in the slides. You can look at the slides if you want to remember. But I also want to say something about the future. And this is an audience that includes a bunch of people studying human-computer interaction as your field. And I want you to think about the challenges for the next 40 years. What should you be doing here? And I have two things that I want to leave you with. One is this notion of generative theory. I want you to think about interaction as a phenomenon in its own right, worthy of study. And that's the back and forth over time in a context between a human user and a technology. And it can be studied, and we can learn from it, and we can apply what we learn to the design of new technology. And I get asked by journalists, what's the cool new technology that's going to come out? And at this point, I think you saw the little Deck Talk guy, you know, but the claymation character, that's from 1983 or something like that. We've had this technology, not as fancy and whatever, but we've had this technology for a long time. What we're missing is the interaction. That's the part we need to get better at. And the second thing is that I want to see us do human-centered artificial intelligence. AI is here. It will be used, but we want to think about how to create AI systems that are not a batch process, there's a servant I delegate to, but a real collaboration, what I call a human-computer partnership, where users become more skilled over time when they use these systems. And you take advantage of the best characteristics of both human beings and these systems. And so this is the product of a massive amount of work. I can't thank everybody, but really I have been enormously privileged to work with some really world-class, fantastic people. I have a ton of PhD students over here, master's students, postdocs, my colleagues in France, and there's many more. And then a number of people have been wonderful inspirations to me And I wanted to particularly highlight Hal Abelson, who was the guy who convinced me to come to MIT here. But a number of people who've been really important over the years. And so I want to thank you very
One
much.
naked steers this.
That one?
There we go.
There is one other, just one more thing. So this is Michel, he's my husband, and we've been working together. We've been married for over 30 years, 31 now, right? And we met on a canoe in Aarhus, in Denmark, yes, outside with our colleagues in Denmark, and we've been together ever since. And we have two wonderful sons. One got his degree here from MIT in architecture, and the other one is studying human-computer interaction at UC San Diego as a PhD student. And I just I can't imagine a better life-work balance than working with your husband and having these two wonderful kids. And so thank you very much. So thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I apologize for going so late, but you know, you don't get to do this very often. So thank you.